We should have turned back, my voice snatched by the howling gale. This was supposed to be simple, I muttered under my breath, though it was more for myself than anyone else. Just another hike, like all the others, but higher this time. More challenging, we said. The need to prove myself gnawed at my mind even now. You were always chasing something, my quiet voice inside whispered. Marcus turned, his breath coming out in plumes of white vapor.
We better set up camp, ride the storm out.
Though the frustration in his voice betrayed him, I scowled, biting back a retort. We weren't supposed to be here like this. This wasn't the plan, I managed, the words barely audible through chattering teeth. The cold was like a living thing, clawing through every layer, gnawing at my bones. Snow fell in stinging sheets, driving into my face like shards of glass. Each breath was a battle, each step an agony as we trudged blindly through the storm. I could barely see Marcus a few feet ahead of me, his figure a ghostly blur in the whiteout. Amy, who had been trudging silently behind us, spoke up.
No tents, not in this. There's a cabin up ahead. I can see it.
Her voice was firm, but her eyes, sharp and calculating, held a glint of fear she couldn't hide. It was a strange mix, Marcus and Amy, both strong in their own ways. Marcus was the type who tackled life head-on, all brawn and bravado. Amy had always been the more practical one, the one who saw through all the bluster. And me? I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I was here for the thrill, yes, but deeper down I was running. Running from that thing I could never name but always felt, the cold clawing at the back of my mind. I twisted my ankle, I said, almost as an afterthought, grimacing at the sharp, stabbing pain with each step. But it was more than that. It was the nagging feeling, the sense of being drawn toward something I couldn't yet see.
Lean against me, bruh,
Marcus said, stepping up beside me. His arm slid under mine, his strength making up for my weakness. I nodded, though the fire of frustration burned in my gut. I hated feeling like this, helpless. The cabin loomed out of the white like some forsaken relic, its edges lost in the swirling snow. It looked old, weathered, leaning slightly under the weight of the ice. Its walls were splintered and faded, the roof sagging under the blanket of white. But it was shelter. It was enough. As we approached, I saw it, a wooden sign swinging lazily from a single rusted hook above the door. The words were crudely etched, "Cabin Rules." Marcus, ever the skeptic, glanced at the sign but said nothing. Amy pushed the door open, and we stumbled into the gloom of the cabin. The wind howled outside, a living thing with teeth. But inside the silence was heavy, oppressive, as though the air itself was watching. Marcus moved toward the fireplace, already fumbling for matches.
Come on, work,
he said, his voice tight with exhaustion. I leaned against the cold, cracked wall, still clutching my ankle. Wait, I muttered, pointing toward the door. Did you see the sign? Amy turned, her brow furrowed, clearly impatient with my hesitation.
It's probably a joke, just some local's idea of a good laugh.
And what if it wasn't? My eyes traced the etched words, "Do not light a fire," and below that more rules, too faded to make out without going back into the storm. Marcus, wait, I started, but it was too late. The match struck, a spark flared, and the fire roared to life. The fire crackling with defiance against the cold that pressed in on the cabin, the uneasy silence returned. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my gut, a sense that we had already crossed a line. My ankle throbbed in time with the winds howling outside, but there was something else gnawing at the back of my mind. Seriously, I said, shifting to sit up straighter against the wall. Did you guys actually read the sign out there? It's not just about lighting a fire. Amy, rubbing her hands in front of the flames, glanced up, her face half illuminated by the dancing light.
Yeah, I saw it. Creepy, but that's just some dumb prank. People love to mess with hikers.
Marcus threw a glance toward the door, but didn't speak. His skepticism was written all over his face. I pressed on. It said something about not lighting the fire, sure, but there were other rules, too. I couldn't make them all out because of the snow, but I hesitated, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something's not right. Amy sighed, leaning back on her heels.
So what are you trying to say? That some random cabin in the middle of nowhere has magical rules we're supposed to follow? This is no fantasy. We need that fire to survive.
Maybe, I admitted, though the unease in my stomach twisted tighter. But I just find it strange as to why warn people not to light a fire in a place like this, in a storm like this. The fire would be a no-brainer. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and laced with frustration.
Look, we're lucky we're even here. I don't care about some creepy sign. We need to keep warm.
Amy shrugged, but her eyes lingered on me a moment longer than they should have.
Besides, even if there are more rules, how do we know they're not some dumb local superstition?
I couldn't shake the sensation that we were missing something crucial. What if we broke the rules already, and now... I trailed off, feeling foolish, but I couldn't ignore the growing dread gnawing at me. Marcus groaned, getting to his feet.
Fine. You want to know what it says? I'll grab that damn board so we can all have a laugh. Happy?
Before either of us could protest, Marcus strode toward the door. The wind battered it as he opened it just wide enough to slip out into the night, the snow swallowing him in an instant. Minutes passed, the tension inside the cabin growing thicker, with every gust of wind rattling the walls. Amy sat still, her fingers hovering near the fire, but the confident set of her shoulders had faded. The firelight threw wild shadows across the room, and I couldn't help but feel like the cabin was watching us, like it was waiting. The door creaked open and Marcus staggered inside, the wooden board clutched tightly in his gloved hands. His face was flushed red from the cold, but something else had drained the usual bravado from his expression.
You're not going to like this.
What do you mean?
Amy asked, standing quickly. Marcus set the board down near the fire, leaning it against the cracked wall. The words were now clearly visible, the letters etched deep into the weathered wood. The fire's light flickered over the carved words, making them look almost alive. Amy knelt by the fire, squinting at the board as she traced the deep grooves with her finger, her expression flickering between curiosity and unease.
Okay, let's see what this thing says.
She cleared her throat and began reading aloud.
Do not light a fire.
She raised an eyebrow and gave a little shrug.
Well, we already broke that one.
Shit, we're doomed then, I said sarcastically. Amy chuckled and continued, her voice gaining a sarcastic edge.
Do not leave the cabin. Ignore all visitors.
She paused, looking up at me with a half grin.
Right, so we're basically trapped. And we're supposed to just what? Ignore the Girl Scout selling cookies in the middle of this damn blizzard?
I couldn't help but laugh, even as a sliver of unease twisted in my gut. Yeah, I'll make sure she won't win any badges.
And it gets better. We're not allowed to invite anyone inside, like vampires or something.
Marcus, who had been standing by the door, chimed in with a dry chuckle, though his eyes were still dark with worry.
So, we're on a snowbound episode of Twilight, huh?
Amy stifled another laugh, but her tone shifted when she read the last rule.
Only get out when the sun is out.
She stopped, her smile faltering for a moment before she shook her head again.
That last one actually makes sense.
The room went quiet for a beat, all of us staring at the board. The weight of it was starting to sink in, but there was still that lingering feeling that this had to be a joke, some twisted prank. Honestly, it sounds like some horror movie cliché, I said, shaking my head. Next thing you know, the floorboards start bleeding and we're all characters in a bad B-movie. Amy snorted, pushing the board aside.
Yeah, and that's when we all get picked off one by one. Seriously, who writes this stuff?
We sat there, the laughter slowly fading, the flickering light of the fire casting shadows across the cabin. Amy leaned back against the wall, still shaking her head in disbelief at the absurdity of the rules. For a brief moment things felt lighter, like maybe this really was just some elaborate prank, nothing more than a creepy set of instructions meant to scare off hikers. But then Marcus stood, his expression stiff, one hand gripping the back of the nearest chair. The amusement drained from the room, as we saw the hard set of his jaw, the way his knuckles whitened.
Yeah, I need to tell you guys something.
I looked up at him, feeling a sudden uneasy shift in the air. What do you mean?
When I grabbed the sign, I saw something. Something's out there, bruh.
Marcus said, his voice low, almost like he didn't want to say it out loud. What did you see? He hesitated, rubbing his hand over his face, clearly struggling to find the right words.
I thought it was a trick of the light at first, but it wasn't. It kind of looked like a wolf. Was definitely shaped like one, but bigger. Much bigger, and it had glowing eyes.
The lightness we had forced moments before evaporated in an instant. The words hung in the air, heavier than the wind pounding against the cabin. Amy's face drained of color as she stared at him.
A wolf? You sure? Those don't exist out here.
I'm not shitting you. I know what I saw. It just stared at me from the snow and then vanished. But it didn't move like any wolf I've seen. Like it was broken.
Suddenly, the fire's warmth wasn't comforting anymore. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the weight of Marcus's revelation. The wind outside howled louder as if in response, rattling the windows with more force than before. "So what do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, though I wasn't sure I really wanted an answer. Marcus turned his gaze toward the board, the rules etched into the wood now seeming far more ominous, as if they had become some kind of sentence hanging over us.
The only thing we can do,
he said quietly.
Stay here until the storm ends.
The fire crackled weakly in response, its flames already beginning to die down. The cold had sunk into our bones, creeping up from the floor and clinging to every breath.
This can't last.
Tossing another log into the fire.
We're running low on wood.
Marcus and Amy worked in silence, pulling apart the last remnants of the chair to keep the fire alive.
We'll have to make do. Just keep it going, as long as possible.
The cold was digging in deep, not just into my bones, but into my mind, sharp, relentless, like it knew where I was weakest. My ankle throbbed, sending waves of pain up my leg. But that was nothing compared to the ache of something I couldn't name gnawing at me. The storm raged outside, furious, out of control, and in some twisted way, I knew it mirrored everything I'd been avoiding for years. I looked at Marcus and Amy, moving with a purpose, their bodies outlined in the dim flicker of the fire. They were handling it, keeping busy like nothing was wrong. But me, I was just sitting here, useless, the helpless one again. It wasn't the first time. I'd been letting things slip through my fingers for as long as I could remember. Always running from something, never facing it head on. Always letting others make the calls, and now I should have said something about that sign, those rules. The words haunted me, gnawed at my brain just like the cold did. Do not light a fire. They ignored it, and I didn't stop them. And now we were here, trapped in this rotting cabin that felt too much like a mirror of myself, falling apart, holding up just enough to convince everyone that everything's fine. But the storm, this storm was howling, and the wind, it sounded alive, like it's trying to get in, waiting for the moment we'd slip, the moment I'd fail again. Because it always happens, doesn't it? I let things go, I don't speak up, and everything falls apart. And this time it wasn't just about me, but the plan was clear. We only needed to survive the night, nothing more. I glanced toward the door, feeling the dread building in me. What if surviving wasn't enough? Something was out there. I could feel it just outside, scratching at the walls. We were barely holding on, and it was my fault. Again. Amy sat by the fire, her breath fogging up in front of her. Marcus paced the room like a caged animal, every creak of the wood beneath him setting me on edge. Then came a knock, a dull, muted thud against the door. My body tensed, every hair standing on end. Marcus stopped mid-step, his eyes snapping toward the door. "Did you hear that?" The sound came again, more insistent this time. Amy stood slowly, exchanging a nervous glance with Marcus.
Who would be out there in this storm?
We all stared at the door. My mind raced. No one. There's no one out there. But then a voice, low and muffled by the wind, pleaded from the other side.
Please, please let me in. I'm freezing. Let me in.
My heart pounded in my chest. The voice, though desperate, was unmistakably human. Marcus and Amy exchanged uneasy glances, and I could feel their hesitation, their unspoken fears. The rule was clear. Do not open the door.
We can't just leave someone out there to die.
Amy, wait.
Marcus said, grabbing her arm.
We don't know who it is. What if...
She shook him off, her hand already on the latch.
It's a person. We can't leave them out there.
My throat was dry, my mind racing with panic. The storm outside was raging, but inside everything had gone deadly quiet. I wanted to stop her, to scream for her to follow the rules, but I couldn't find the words. All I could do was watch as Amy slowly cracked open the door, just enough for a gust of icy wind to rush inside. A figure pushed past her, staggering into the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, the latch clicking into place. Amy and Marcus exchanged uncertain glances, but there was no denying the tension that had lifted. Relief washed over me. But it wasn't the kind that settles in and brings peace. No, this was thin, fragile, like the ice over a lake just before it cracks and swallows you whole. She had stumbled in, half frozen, just another lost hiker, and for a second I let myself believe that this whole thing was nothing more than a cruel coincidence. Another human being, no monsters, no ghosts, no reason for the fear that was wrapping itself around my chest like barbed wire. But that relief didn't last long. As she spoke, settling by the fire like she belonged there, her face pale and her hands trembling from the cold.
What took you so long? I was about to die out there.
After a moment, she reached into her backpack, pulling out a small bag.
Here,
She said, tossing a strip of jerky toward Marcus.
you all look like you could use something to eat.
Thank goodness.
Marcus said through a mouthful, his mood seemingly improving.
Why are you out there alone?
She leaned closer to the fire, her face softening as the warmth finally started to chase away the deep cold that had settled in her bones.
Name's Mia, by the way.
She said, her voice steadier now.
The storm hit hard and I lost sight of my group. Lucky I saw this place.
She handed another piece to Amy and then one to me. The salty, savory smell hit my nose, and despite everything, my stomach growled. I took a bite, letting the taste pull me out of my head for a second. I hadn't realized just how hungry I was. As I chewed on that piece of jerky, I still couldn't shake the feeling that we'd done something wrong. It wasn't just the rules, it was me. I knew it before she stepped through the door, but I kept my mouth shut, just like I had when Marcus lit the fire. We broke the rules. I let them break the rules. I watched the flames flicker against her pale skin, feeling the weight of every decision I didn't make pressing in on me. I thought about all the times in my life when I knew better but stayed silent, let things happen, let other people lead me into their messes. It was always easier that way, wasn't it? Just go along, hope for the best, and when things went to shit, at least I didn't have to be the one to blame.
Thanks for letting me in. I was about ready to freeze to death.
Yeah, well, you're lucky Marcus here didn't follow the rules on that board.
Nodding toward the wooden sign propped against the wall. Mia glanced at the board, squinting at the words carved into the weathered wood.
What rules?
It's got some weird stuff written on it. Don't light a fire, don't leave the cabin, ignore all visitors.
He recited, ticking them off on his fingers.
Oh, and the best part, do not invite anyone in.
I watched Mia's expression shift from curiosity to something like amusement.
So you're telling me you shouldn't have let me in?
She said, grinning.
Exactly. According to those rules, you're supposed to be knocking out there all night while we sit in the dark, freezing to death.
That's messed up. Whoever did that has got a sick sense of humor.
She gave the board a dismissive glance.
I mean, come on, if we followed those rules, we wouldn't even have this fire going and I'd still be out there in the snow. Clearly it's just some fucked up joke.
Yeah, we were just saying that. If we'd taken that thing seriously, we'd be freezing, starving, and, well, dead by now.
Exactly.
Someone probably got a kick out of the idea of scaring the hell out of people who find this place.
The rules hadn't been some prank. I could feel it, could feel the wrongness creeping into the cabin with every breath. And the worst part, I'd known. I'd felt it in my gut, deep down where it always sits. The part of me that's scared to death of doing something wrong. So scared I do nothing at all. The fire was burning down faster than any of us expected, the warmth fading almost as quickly as it had arrived. We huddled together, our bodies pressing against one another, trying to keep the cold at bay. My eyelids were heavy, the weight of exhaustion pulling me under. But I fought against it. Sleep would be a death sentence out here, especially with everything that had happened. Marcus was dozing lightly, his head nodding forward, while Amy and Mia sat close, whispering in hushed tones. My body felt numb, the ache in my ankle dulled by the cold, but I could still feel the throbbing. Every breath sent a puff of white into the air, a reminder that the temperature inside the cabin was dropping. I fought to stay awake, my vision blurring as I blinked, but the pull was strong. Just a moment, I thought, just a moment to rest. Scratch. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. The others heard it too. The scratching outside the cabin. At first it was faint, distant, just a subtle scrape, barely noticeable through the wind, but then it grew louder, more persistent. Marcus sat up, his face pale, his breath catching in his throat.
What the fuck is that?
The scratching was getting closer, circling the cabin, moving with deliberate intent. Amy's eyes were wide, her knuckles white as she gripped her jacket. Mia stared at the door, her lips pressed into a thin line. The scratching shifted, turning into slow, deliberate footsteps. They stopped just outside the door, and I swallowed hard, the air in the cabin growing thick with fear. No one moved. We all stared at the door, the wind howling outside, but the knocking persisted. Someone or something was out there, waiting.
Do you think it's another hiker?
The knock came again, more insistent. A voice followed, low and desperate.
Let me in.
Amy and Mia exchanged glances, and before I could react, they were both moving toward the door, their hands reaching for the latch. No, something felt wrong, so very, very wrong. The voice didn't just feel like a sound. It was inside my head, burrowing there like a command, not heard with my ears but imprinted on my mind. "No!" I shouted, my voice cracking as I lunged forward. "Stop!" They froze, their hands inches from the latch, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. The voice, it wasn't outside, I whispered, my heart racing. It was in my head, like it was telling me to open the door. Amy hesitated, her eyes darting back to the door, then to me.
What are you talking about?
But before anyone could process what I'd said, the latch clicked. Slowly, on its own, the door creaked open. A gust of icy wind swept in, sending shivers down our spines. We all stared, waiting for whatever was out there. A figure stood in the doorway. A man, but not quite. He was drenched in sweat, despite the storm raging outside. His skin was too smooth, too perfect, like a poorly made mask stretched over something that wasn't human. His eyes darted around the room with an eerie, mechanical precision, and his mouth twisted into something that resembled a smile, but felt all wrong.
"We need shelter,"
the man said, though the voice didn't match his lips. It was plural, we, but there was only him. His body twitched, his movements unnatural, as if every joint was just slightly off.
"Help us,"
he pleaded, stepping forward.
"We need to come in."
I could barely breathe, my mind racing as the rules flashed in my head. "No invites," I shouted, taking a step back, the words tumbling out in panic. "We can't let that thing in." The man's expression darkened, his too perfect smile twisting into something sharper. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing.
"We will be waiting."
The door slammed shut with a force that seemed to reverberate through the cabin, silencing the howling wind outside. For a moment the only sound was the crackle of the dying fire and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The others stared at me wide-eyed, frozen in place. Amy was the first to speak, her voice shaky but relieved.
That was close. Thank God you stopped us.
Yeah, we could have let something in.
I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but the rush of relief washed over me. For once I had spoken up. I had stopped them from making a fatal mistake. I had finally taken control when it mattered.
Good call, man. You saved us.
We needed to follow the rules. It felt good. No, better than good. It felt like redemption. How many times had I let things slip? How many moments had I watched from the sidelines, paralyzed by indecision or doubt? But not this time. This time I'd stood up, stopped the chaos, and kept us safe. For the first time in a long time, the fire in my gut wasn't frustration. It was something warm, something like pride. By the time the first sliver of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, the storm had quieted. The wind had softened to a dull whisper, the snow no longer whipping against the windows. Light filtered into the room, pale and fragile, but it was enough.
We made it.
Marcus whispered, as if saying it out loud would break the spell. We moved quickly, gathering our things with a newfound urgency. The weight that had pressed down on us all night began to lift, placed by the warm glow of survival. My ankle still throbbed, but I barely felt it. We had survived the night. I had survived the night. Marcus helped me to my feet, his arm around my shoulder.
We just need to get off this mountain,
he said, his voice bright with confidence.
We're almost out.
The air was biting, but the morning sky was clear, bright, a promise of escape. Snow crunched under our feet as we trudged forward, each step lighter than the last. We had made it. We were walking away from this nightmare. We did it, I whispered to myself, feeling the weight lift from my chest. We actually did it. Amy laughed, a sound that felt out of place after everything, but it was real.
God, I can't wait for a warm bed.
Or just a hot shower at this point.
We laughed together, the cold no longer cutting as deep, and for the first time since we'd entered the cabin, the tension had melted away. We had beaten it. The storm, the rules, the creeping dread, it was behind us now. But as we pushed forward, the snow began to change. It thickened, grew denser, not snow anymore. It was something solid, something heavy. It clung to our legs, slowing our steps. Marcus grunted, pushing forward, but his movements became labored, his boots sinking deeper with every step.
What's going on?
Amy's voice was sharp, fear creeping back in.
It's like we're stuck.
I stopped, panic clawing at the back of my mind. The snow, it wasn't letting us leave. My heart hammered against my ribs as the realization hit me, cold and merciless. No! I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. No, no, no! Mia turned, her eyes wide with terror.
We need to go back.
We can't go back in there.
Marcus's voice cracked with desperation, but the snow was closing in, thick and impenetrable, an invisible barrier trapping us, sealing us in. I stared at the horizon, at the clear sky, at the morning sun that had felt like salvation just moments ago, but now it was mocking us. We weren't free. Defeated, we turned back. Each step toward the cabin was heavier than the last, the snow dragging us down, pulling us back to where we had started. My ankle throbbed with every step, but the pain in my chest was worse. The weight of it was crushing, like the realization that we hadn't escaped, that we were never meant to escape. The cabin loomed ahead, dark and silent, the same as when we'd first stumbled upon it. We stepped inside, and the warmth that had once been a small comfort now felt like a trap, like the walls themselves were closing in. As the door clicked shut behind us, I noticed something strange, the wooden board, the rules. I froze, watching in horror as the letters began to shift. The words twisted and cracked, rearranging themselves until a new message was carved deep into the wood. Those who break the silence invite their own end. My blood ran cold. I stared at the words, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. The silence. My silence. Was this my fault? Had speaking up? Had saving them doomed us all? The others turned to me, waiting, expecting me to say something, to lead, but I couldn't. The words hung in the air like a sentence, heavier than the storm, heavier than anything I could bear. I had spoken up. I had done what I thought was right, but in the end it hadn't mattered. Or worse, it was the very thing that doomed us. I sank down against the wall. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. No matter what I had done, no matter how hard I had tried, there was no escape. The others sat in silence, waiting for me to speak, to lead. But I couldn't. I was back to where I'd started, silent, powerless, trapped. The only sound left was the faint, relentless scratching at the door.